case research projects can unfold in so many different ways. It's very, very difficult to offer general suggestions that apply to every context. So what I will do here is simply focus on some of the contexts that I've encountered in my own research. And what I find is when a case research process begins, the organization has agreed to do the research. They've agreed to how the research is going to be conducted. Nevertheless, they haven't gotten into the specifics. So the first stage I recommend actually involves establishing very specific ground rules in a number of areas. So some of the areas that I have found it's useful to have ground rules is what we do with material from interviews. Are we going to be recording the interviews? Is it okay to paraphrase interviews? And sometimes we'll actually ask individuals for specific quotes. You want to make sure that the organization understands how you're planning to have interviews, whether recording will be optional, that sort of thing, and let them know so they're not surprised when an employee comes to them and says, well, this investigator asked me to record my conversation and are you getting ready to fire me? Or you want to make sure there's as little nervousness as possible about this process. Another area that can be very sensitive is circulating drafts of stuff you've written about the organization. Typically, organizations are going to want to have approval rights before anything gets published. But in the draft stage, the question then becomes, how will you circulate that material? Now, in some cases, you'll want the right to actually provide materials individual access to material that's relevant to them. If I'm doing interviews, for example, I don't like to have interview materials gathered from one individual circulated around the organization until I know that individual is comfortable with them. My goal is not to basically snag individuals in lies or have them broadcast opinions that they thought they were giving to me in private. So that is one area that you may want to clarify. Another is, do you want to have a particular member in the organization coordinate the transmission of drafts around? Is there a group of people who will want to see each draft all at the same time? I call that broadcast. And then there's sort of a managed draft, which is a little like coordinated, but that means the person who is the contact point for case research will essentially determine the disposition of all drafts. There are some other issues. A lot of times when you're developing a case, you will encounter some material that may involve copyrights or other permissions. Whose responsibility is it to get permission? Is this going to be someone within the organization? Is it going to be someone, the case writer? Is it going to be a mixture of responsibilities? For example, if you're dealing with a media company or a company that produces content, can you take photographs and incorporate that into the case? Or who's going to give permission and where does the permission come from? Something as simple as snapping a photograph of an office which happens to have an artwork on the wall, you could potentially be violating copyrights. And typically these things are not that difficult to deal with as long as you anticipate them. What you don't want to have happen is discover they're a problem afterwards. Another big issue in this is setting up interview schedules so that basically When you're doing a case research within a large organization, chances are you're going to have to talk to a lot of different people. Who is going to determine who you talk to and how the meetings are arranged? It might be the contact that you're dealing with, the protagonist in a discussion case or the central contact in a research case. That role may be delegated to some administrator on the site, for example, an administrative assistant to your contact. Or it may be up to the case writer. It may be the case writer is expected to call these individuals of interest and set it up. Obviously, having the case writer do it is perhaps the most efficient way, but a lot of organizations may not want the case writer making calls to different people within the organization without getting the permission of the contact. So you just want to make sure that you don't step on any toes by virtue of what you're doing. How you are going to store the data that is gathered in the case can be very, very important to organizations. For example, the National Science Foundation actually now requires that any research proposal include a data storage plan because there is such concern of data getting into the wrong hands. So what you need to do is you need to clarify with the organization where documents are going to get stored, what form interviews are going to get stored in. If you've got recordings, what happens to the recordings? When do they get disposed of? Work products of you, the investigator, for example, notes. Maybe you've done some spreadsheet analyses, that sort of thing. Who gets to see them? Who gets to determine where they're shared? When do they get disposed of? How do we secure them before they're disposed of? These are details that probably you don't want to go into until the case has been approved and you're getting set up for the actual process, which is why I included in the conduct of the research. But nevertheless, they're details that you ought to have well understood before you begin the actual research data gathering. So what about the actual data gathering process? Again, it's really hard to generalize this because what I describe here might be overkill for a small case research project with a very small organization. And on the other hand, it might not be sufficient if you're dealing with a large multi-investigator case research project across multiple organizations. But the key thing in any case project is to organize the data as you collect it and think about how you're going to organize it in advance as opposed to waiting until you've actually got the data coming in. So there's a whole variety of different types of data that you're likely to get in case research. Certainly one of the most common types is going to be interviews. And it's going to be very important that when you conduct interviews, you have a protocol set up and that you follow that protocol. If you have had IRB approval for the case, you will have had to supply them with an interview protocol. And it's critical that you follow it because if you violate that interview protocol, there's a good chance that your results could be thrown out before they're published if the IRB discovers that. So when you're creating a protocol, the elements of the protocol need to be sufficiently detailed so another investigator could basically follow it. Now, that doesn't mean you can't ask open-ended questions, and it doesn't mean you can't ask, follow-up questions that you have not listed in the protocol, but you have to identify the fact that you are going to be asking follow-up questions when appropriate. The contents of an interview can be stored in many different ways. You could have them done with notes, with recordings. You could have transcripts made of the recording. And there are a variety of analytical techniques that can be applied to interviews, such as coding techniques. And some of them expect full transcripts. Some of them work fine with interviewer notes. Make sure that you know how you're going to record information from interviews. Make sure that the organization agrees with it, and make sure that the form is consistent with the way that you want to analyze the data, because it's very hard when you suddenly change how you're dealing with the data midstream. One just sort of general practical suggestion that I have in interviews is always try to arrange a follow-up availability. So you might ask the interviewee to verify the interview that you've given them. You might have additional questions you want to ask. See if you can get the interviewee's contact information so that you can do the follow-up if necessary. Most of the time it won't be, but again, it's very frustrating when you have to throw out an interview because you didn't ask a question or you forgot to ask it. Finally, I suggest you develop some system of identification codes. And this applies to all your materials, but particularly interviews, so that after you've been out and conducted 23 interviews, you don't have to try to figure out which interview you heard something in. And so, if you can keep the interview together with the notes and perhaps establish a database for handling this type of material, you're going to be a lot happier. Now, there are lots of other things besides interviews, and in a sense, you're running into the same storage and indexing issues. So, archival data from the sites. Whenever possible, try to acquire the documents in electronic form. They're going to be a lot easier to store and probably a lot easier to search. And when you start marking up your own notes on these documents, make sure you don't do it on the originals, because you may regret that, since it's hard to white out handwritten notes on a document. I would recommend developing an organizational scheme for documents as well, and ideally maybe the same scheme that you use for interviews. And sometimes putting keywords in documents is a big help. Of course, if the documents are in electronic form and they're text-based, you can often search them on your own drive, and so keep them in a folder, which will allow you to search for things if you need to access stuff later on. Retention is a big issue. Make sure you don't retain documents longer than you said you will. That's something that you should have agreed had agreements with the organization for, and you want to make sure that you follow those agreements. With public documents, there's a lot less concern about retention, and there's a lot less concern about security, but it's easy to lose track of them. So make sure that every document you pull from the web has the website where you sourced it. Also, I recommend, if you're dealing with websites, whenever you're planning to source a website, print out the contents of the area that you're going to source. You can do that in your browser with Control P or File Print, and that can be very critical because websites can change. And so if you cite a website as part of your research, you want to make sure that you've got an original copy so that if the site changes, they don't think that you've just made up the citation. Another thing you have to think about is intermediate work products. A lot of times when I'm doing case analyses, I will often take data that the organization has given me and I will transform it in ways that make it more suitable for the case. That's particularly true for discussion cases, but the same applies to research cases. That material still could have proprietary information from the organization, and just because you have altered it does not make it any less proprietary. So you want to make sure that there are rules in place for your intermediate work products and that you follow those products and have a clear policy regarding the retention of that information. It more or less goes without saying that analysis is going to be a very important part of any case research project. And unfortunately, once again, it's really hard to talk about this in very general terms. So I'll just make a few basic comments about the checklist. Obviously, one of the most important things that you're going to want to do from your primary data, such as interviews and documents, is to identify key themes. And you want to make it very clear how you're going about developing these key themes. Obviously, one important way that we're seeing a lot of in the social sciences is coding techniques such as thematic coding or axial coding, and these can be applied to transcripts, interview notes. They could also potentially be applied to documents that are available electronically in text form. And whatever protocol you use should be very clearly described with the goal that if another investigator perform the protocol, they would come up with similar results. One thing I like to do when I'm gathering data is incorporate some structured questions into my interviews and maybe even conduct surveys within the organization. And you'll see some evidence of that within some of the cases that I used as examples earlier in the module. The nice thing about structured questions is they do allow for analysis. It doesn't have to be statistical significance. Just things like analyzing frequencies can be useful. Many of the coding techniques are specifically designed to do that at the word level, but sometimes you just want to get a sense of the interviewee's reaction to something. Do you like this? Do you not like this? And structured questions can make it a lot easier, and they're going to help a lot in the write-up. Truthfully, you don't want to rely on them that heavily because most of the time when you're inventing structured questions, you really have not tested to see that you've got a valid instrument. But nevertheless, they can be useful and sometimes even compelling in your write-up. There are a lot of analytical software tools that can be used to help you do the analysis. Tools like NVivo are very useful for doing some of the data chunking work with interviews. There's still going to be a very subjective component to interviews, but using these software tools and developing some facility with them can be very helpful in terms of conducting the process more efficiently. Of course, one of the things that I have continued to emphasize with respect to research is this notion of triangulation. And when we're talking about triangulation, the most important that I have found in most case research is triangulating based upon different sources of data. So when you can take the results from interviews, from documents that you've identified in the firm, maybe from surveys you've conducted, maybe from the research literature, when they all point to the same finding, it makes that finding much, much more compelling than if it just comes from a single source, such as the opinion of someone you've interviewed. And as I have indicated, data triangulation is the big advantage that research cases have over many other qualitative research techniques. And you should take advantage of it whenever you can. And that means that you really need to be familiar with the data that's coming in from all these different sources. You can also do methodological triangulation if you have data like surveys or information from structured interviews that adds a slight quantitative element to the more qualitative tools that are used during the course of interviewing. And indeed, coding even adds a little bit of the patina of quantitative research to highly qualitative interviews. If you're doing a large research project, replicating investigators is going to be an important way of triangulating. Essentially, if two investigators come up with the same perspective on a situation, that is going to be very helpful in convincing people that this is not just a subjective bias. Sometimes you may not have the opportunity to have two investigators going out and essentially asking the same questions to the same people. But one thing you can sometimes do is get the two investigators to look at the same piece of data and then discuss the implications with each other and come to a consensus. That's not quite as powerful as having them look at the things independently and then seeing if they correlate, but the consensus is perhaps a little better than nothing. One of the things that I did in my expert system investigation was I triangulated by studying the systems in whatever detail I could based on the research literature. Then when I did my interviews, I had a number of structured questions. And when the structured question response seemed very different from what I would have expected based upon my understanding of the system, then I would ask the interviewer or the interviewee to explain a little bit more. And what I would say is about half the time, it just turned out they didn't understand the question. That's a reliability problem. But then the other half the time, there was some nuance that I didn't understand about the system. And basically having the interviewee explain their response helped me gain further insights into each expert system I was studying. So sometimes even the interviewee can be a source of replication and triangulation for structured data. Finally, when you're doing triangulations, what you should always try to do is come up with alternative explanations. And a number of times in this module, I've talked about the challenge of having a single case and nothing to benchmark it about. Well, when you are doing your analysis, if you can come up with alternative explanations, and this might be based on alternative theories, or it might be something less formal, then in a sense you get to benchmark the evidence against these different explanations and try to figure out which explanation is more compelling. This is a nice way to do analysis. It gives you something to talk about, and it can make your write-up much more interesting. And will also help address the so what question, because once you've got competing explanations, the so what factor is determined by, well, let's see if we can get the right explanation or the better explanation.